In this video, I'm talking about the Sony ZV-E1, a full-frame camera, which I know a lot of people are very interested in. But I want to talk about the 5 limitations that I've found with this camera, which might make you think otherwise in terms of whether you should buy this or not. So the first limitation of this camera is costs. And not the cost of the body, but the cost of what goes there. Remember, it's a full-frame camera, and full-frame cameras need full-frame lenses, and full-frame lenses are expensive. To get the best quality image out of this little body, you need good first-party lenses, and every first-party lens on the Sony ecosystem, bar the 50-1.8, are expensive, or at least more expensive than if you were getting a Micro Four Third camera, or the FX30 even, which is not a full-frame camera. So that is one thing to keep in mind when thinking about getting this one. For me, this is not the first camera, and I wouldn't recommend that people get this as their first Sony full-frame camera, because, well, you've got to build up your array of lenses, you've got to build up all of your ecosystem before you think about buying this, which is why myself and a lot of other people on the internet, on YouTube, think that this makes a best or a fantastic secondary camera, but not the first camera. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Lenses will be expensive. Heat, and more heat. That's one of the biggest gripes and concerns people have before or after purchasing the Sony ZV-E1. And that's the same concern I had, actually, because everyone on YouTube was worried that, hey, this camera gets hot, too hot, can't record for 10 seconds, for 10 minutes, for 20 minutes, and that's worrying. It's not been as big a concern as other people have made it out to be for me. The main reason is, well, I live in the UK and it is shockingly cold here majority of the time. It doesn't get past 21 on the best of days. So I don't have to worry about it getting hot, at least when I'm filming in the UK. But yes, it does get hot. It has gotten hot on me, but it's never shut down. Even in indoor 22 degrees when it's freezing, I've got to turn the heating up, and this has just survived nicely. So yes, it is a worry, especially if you're shooting a podcast, which a lot of people have said, just don't buy this. If you're going to shoot 60 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours of full footage on 4K 60, just don't do it. For me, I use this camera for, well, recording these kind of setups. Of course, I'm using the A7 IV in this one, but I've used this for a lot of my previous videos, and I've recorded long stints, around 30 minutes, 40 minutes continuous recording on 4K 24, and it's been fine. So for me, it isn't a concern, but if you live in a very hot country, well done. I'm jealous. But second, do keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that this body is very small, and you can see that I've got a small rig on the camera just so that I can make it comfortable to hold in my slightly larger than average hands. This makes it pretty much exactly like my A7 IV. Holding this is easier than it would be if I didn't have this rig on it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you're using this for run and gun items and you don't have a rig, it's going to shake more, your footage might be blurrier or, you know, not as stabilized as you'd like to. But by adding this extra $25 pound accessory, it makes this camera pretty good and a workhorse, really, and dropping it is also less of a worry. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The other limitation of this camera is that it only has a single SD card slot. Now, how much of a limitation is that really? That really depends on you. What kind of work you do, what kind of environments you're working in. If it's controlled environments, you're unlikely to face issues using a single SD card slot, and you can probably use this as a cam, like I have been doing for my YouTube videos or other professional work, where I know I'm in an indoor environment and the environment isn't changing much, relatively. I would be worried if I was using this as a wedding A-cam. I would use it, but I would be careful of using it. And one of the reasons why I would be careful, but I would still use it, is because majority of the times I'm shooting short bursts. I'm using this camera to shoot 2 minutes of this, 5 minutes of this, 2 minutes of this, which means it gives me time to go back, have a look at whether the footage turned out okay or not. At which point I know that it's still working, my SD card hasn't gone corrupt, and yada, yada, yada. Right? So that is how I would use this as an A-cam if I was using it for professional work. I wouldn't use this for professional work where you need to have this on for 60 to 90 to 120 minutes without you having to check whether things are going well or not. But for majority of us who are going to film our kids, our friends, someone else's friend, YouTube videos, what have you, it's not really a concern, and it's not going to be. So don't worry about it. This brings me to a couple of smaller items that I think are worth mentioning, or at least I would call them kind of limitations if you're thinking about buying the Sony ZV-E1. The first one is that it has a micro HDMI port. I just don't know why they did this. My A7 IV, which costs roughly the same and is a hybrid camera, has a full HDMI port. So yes, it's a smaller body, but come on, man, it's for filming movies. Just put it in there, and they didn't. So it's worth knowing. It can be annoying. I've got an adapter, cost me 10 quid, but you know, I thought you might want to know this. And the final one is that this camera has enhanced stabilization, which is fantastic, but it means that it's going to crop even further than it's gonna. So thank God it's a full frame camera, because you can put a 20mm on there and it's going to become 24 or 26, which is fine at an arm's length, but it's worth knowing. Very minor, but worth knowing nonetheless. And there we have it. Those are the 5 limitations that I really wanted you to know, and they really rank from high priority to, maybe you don't care about them. Starting with knowing the cost of full-frame lenses. They will cost you a lot more money. The camera does dissipate a lot of heat, but if you live in the UK, you'll be fine, and if you live somewhere hot, then congratulations. The body is very small, which is good, but also bad because you're not going to be able to hold it comfortably, and so spending a little bit of money to get a rig on it will make your life a lot easier. It's not really a limitation, I would say, but it's worth knowing, because like with most camera equipment, getting the camera itself is expensive, but then you have to do a lot of add-ons, like a rig, like the lenses, like the SD cards, like the micro HDMI connector to turn it into a full HDMI connector. So the costs will add on, but you knew that already, right? That's it. That is the Sony ZV-E1, a camera that I would recommend to a lot of people, but with the limitations that I've just spoken about. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, and maybe I can make a review of this, and you'd like to know why I've still got a hold of this camera. I'm Sohail, and I'll see you in the next one.